Ralph Waldo Emerson once made the observation that the entire world loves a lover. We love a good love story. Now, if Emerson was right, then it would seem to reason that the book of Hosea should be our favorite book in the Bible. But yet I find it very interesting that as we look at this book tonight, that in all fairness, James, if we were going through any other normal routine of sermon regimen, this would end up on the shelf and it would stay there. We don't talk about this book a lot. It doesn't get talked about in the pulpit, doesn't get talked about in Sunday school classes. I think we know why, okay? But we're really missing out on a truly great love story. This is a story that talks about God. It's told through the story of a broken-hearted prophet that reveals God's love and it demonstrates His grace. Now, a lot of the story itself can be summed up in the first chapter of the book. We will not read the whole book tonight. In fact, there's a lot of the story that will go unsaid. I want to read, if you will, we're going to read the first chapter, and after that, I want to talk about something that's important. I'm going to leave a lot of the actual study of the book itself for your own personal reading, but I hope that we can whet our appetite enough tonight that it will reignite our desire to study this great book. Hosea chapter 1, beginning in verse 1. The word of the Lord came to Hosea, son of Beeri, during the reigns of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, and during the reign of Jeroboam, son of Jehoash, king of Israel. When the Lord began to speak through Hosea, the Lord said to him, Go marry a promiscuous woman, and have children with her. For like an adulterous wife, this land is guilty of unfaithfulness to the Lord. So he married Gomer, daughter of Dileam, and she conceived and bore him a son. Then the Lord said to Hosea, Call him Jezreel, because I will soon punish the house of Jehu for the massacre at Jezreel, and I will put an end to the kingdom of Israel. In that day I will break Israel's bow in the valley of Jezreel. Gomer conceived again and gave birth to a daughter. Then the Lord said to Hosea, Call her Lo Ruhamah. Is that close? All right. I think so too. Which means not loved. That's what's significant for us. For I will no longer show love to Israel, that I should at all forgive them. Yet I will show love to Judah, and I will save them, not by my bow, sword, or battle, or by horses or horsemen, but I, the Lord their God, will save them. And after she had weaned, lo, Ruhamah, okay, Gomer had another son. Then the Lord said, I will call him Lo Ami, which means not my people. For you are not my people, and I am not your God. Yet the Israelites will be like the sands on the seashore, which cannot be measured or counted. In the place where it was said to them, You are not my people, they will be called children of the living God. The people of Judah and the people of Israel will come together. They will appoint one leader and will come up out of the land, for great will be the day of Jezreel. Now, we'll return to the story of Hosea in just a moment. We need to stop because there is a bigger picture here. There is the story of Hosea and Gomer. That's a critical part, obviously, of this story, but there's an overriding significance of the story even that's being told and lived out. And that's the part of this central theme of God's covenant with Israel. This is the covenant that goes all the way back to Exodus 19, beginning in verse 4, where God tells Moses, As you yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all the nations you will be my treasured possessions. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And at that, the Israelites responded in verse 8 of Exodus 19, "We will do everything the Lord has said." The covenant was established, but Israel was not faithful. Israel was not faithful to the covenant. Neither did the northern kingdom nor the southern kingdom. It was a series of ups and downs as we're going through and we're reading of all these kings. There will be some kings that they helped, that the king lived in the, what would it be, in the line of like David. That would be the comparison. We lived in such a way to please the Lord, but oftentimes did not, would do evil in the eyes of the Lord. And so it was a series of ups and downs, but the covenant itself was really just taking a beating. And if anything, what deserves to be recognized out of that is the patience of God. But as we turn to the book of Hosea, there are two significant charges that are made. Both are in Hosea chapter 4. I want to read those. We're going to begin in Hosea chapter 4, beginning in verse 1. This is where he outlines the charge against the people of Israel. Hosea 4, verse 1. "Hear the word of the Lord, you Israelites, because the Lord has a charge to bring against you who live in the land. There is no faithfulness, no love, no acknowledgement of God in the land. There is only cursing, lying, and murder, stealing, and adultery. They break all bounds, and bloodshed follows bloodshed. Because of this, the land dries up, and all who live in it waste away. The beasts of the fields, the birds of the sky, and the fish of the sea are swept away." Now, if you'll remember back to the book of Deuteronomy around chapters 28 and 29, as God is delivering this message of the covenant to the Israelites as they are about to enter the promised land, and he talks about the blessings and the cursings. And basically, if the people were faithful to God, then there would be good things that happen. Basically, everything you've just read here, it would be just the opposite. But there is a lot of attention given in Deuteronomy, and obviously here as well, of what would happen if the Israelites were not faithful to that covenant. And what has happened, what is now coming to fruition in the book of Hosea, is the fact that the people are not being faithful. And God is about to prove that He is a God who says what He means and He means what He says. And so here we are. But the charge is not just against the people, the charge is also against the religious leaders. So let's look at that. That's in chapter 4, verse 4. "But let no one bring a charge, let no one accuse another, for your people are like those who bring charges against a priest. You stumble day and night, and the prophets stumble with you. So I will destroy your mother. My people are destroyed from lack of knowledge. Because you have rejected knowledge, I also reject you as my priest. Because you have ignored the law of your God, I also will ignore your children. The more priests there were, the more they sinned against me. They exchanged their glorious God for something disgraceful. They feed on the sins of my people and relish their wickedness. And it will be like people, like priests. I will punish both of them for their ways and repay them for their deeds." We're familiar with the phrase today, you only had one job. You only had one job. It's kind of like the cot that we had put outside in our back driveway to just get some sunshine and air out that gets used a lot on trips and stuff like that. And so I had told one of my children, Andy, yesterday to get it and to bring it back in. No, was it Joey? I thought it was Andy. Okay. You see how this works out? Yeah. All right, so at this point, I look at the three of my children and say, you've only had one job. Get it in, just one job. You had one job. The priests only had one job. And that was to take this law that was given at Sinai And that was put, all of these religious matters were put in the hands of the priest to be able to make it where the sacrifices could be offered. There were provisions made for the tabernacle to be moved from one place to the other, to the detail that said that this part of the Levites would carry the poles, and you would carry the sacred articles, and you would carry the other parts. I mean, all of that was detailed out. When they got there, they knew who was to do what. But the important thing through all of this is that the commands of God be kept. You only had one job, and they weren't faithful to it. And it's hard. I look at it from my position today, and I look at what I do. There are a lot of times in ministry that I look at whether it's elders, whether it's deacons, whether it's ministers, teachers, and there are times I just want to say we need to be careful. We don't need to get so distracted because sometimes our job is as simple as one job. And if this church moves from one generation to the next, and this church is known as one that doesn't have knowledge, that is drying up for a lack of knowledge, that will fall on those of us who are preachers and teachers. That's why James 3 would say it's a pretty significant deal. We have one job. Now, in all fairness, can I tell you this? It gets hard to preach to an empty chair. And it gets hard to teach Sunday school to an empty pew. It is important that teachers properly prepare and present those lessons. But it is equally as important for people to be there, to be prepared, to listen and to learn. There's nothing that says, even if the priests had done their job, that the people were going to follow them. I mean, they did have Moses as their leader in Numbers 13 and 14, and they still wanted to rebel. Moses is the guy that's known as the most humble man to ever walk the face of the earth, and they still wanted to revolt. They wanted to take him out. But by the time we get to Hosea, this is not a finger-pointing session between the people and the priests. God looks at the whole situation, and again, if I can use South Arkansas terminology, the whole thing stinks. The way the people are living is not right. The way the priests are teaching and the way they're conducting themselves, it's not right. And so there's about to be a reckoning for that. Now, here's the big question that I would like for us to address, and then we'll close out with a beautiful point. But here's the big thing that I want us to address in Hosea, that in my study for this lesson, of all the ways that I thought I would go, this part just kind of mushroomed into the big question. And the big question that is often asked is, did this story even take place? Was this marriage a real marriage? 4 big ideas that come up. We're going to work our way through from what I think is going to be closer to the real answer. All right? But we need to be aware of these, and we need to know how to answer and why some people think what they think concerning matters like this. The first idea, the first theory, if you will, is that the whole thing is just hypothetical. That the idea of Hosea, this godly man, this prophet, marrying some woman that is just, I like promiscuous is probably the most polite term of all of our translations, all right? But she was not faithful to him, and that has children, and the children's names and the meaning of those names are indicative of the fact that this was just a horrible family situation. But people will look at that and they'll say the whole thing is really hypothetical. And the reason that they say that, it goes back to these passages in Leviticus chapter 21, verses 7 and then verse 14. Verse 7, now this is speaking of priests, and I'll have more to say about that in a minute. This is speaking of priests in Leviticus 21:7. They must not marry women defiled by prostitution or divorced from their husbands, because priests are holy to their God. Verse 14 continues, he must not marry a widow, a divorced woman, or a woman defiled by prostitution, but only a virgin from his own people. Even as we go through and we look in Hosea, verses that we read, verse 2, 4, 6, and 9, the call to marry a promiscuous woman, and then the names of the children that point, that point to the problems at Jezreel that says that you're no longer loved. How would you like for your name to mean I'm not loved? How would you like for your name to mean not my people? That's this family dynamic. And so people look at that and they say that the whole thing is hypothetical. I can't land there. All right? I'll tell you why in just a minute. Let's go to the second one. The second idea is this, that the story is about spiritual unfaithfulness, not physical unfaithfulness. That really when it talks about Gomer, it wasn't that Gomer cheated on Hosea in a physical fashion, but that she worshiped idols and that she, worshiped these false gods. Now, the reason that idea holds some merit is because of the times in the Old Testament of where God would refer to Israel cheating and would call it adultery. Whether it's in the book of Proverbs, we look in Jeremiah as the passage I've got listed for you, Jeremiah chapter 3, verses 6 through 9. Listen to this passage. During the reign of King Josiah, the Lord said to me, have you seen what faithless Israel has done? She has gone up on every high hill and under every spreading tree and has committed adultery there. I thought that after she had done all this, she would return to me, but she did not, and her unfaithful sister Judah saw it. I gave faithless Israel her certificate of divorce and sent her away because of all of her adulteries. Yet I saw that her unfaithful sister Judah had no fear, and so she went out and committed adultery. Because Israel's immorality mattered so little to her, she defiled the land and committed the adultery with stone and wood. The whole passage there in Jeremiah 3, verses 6 through 9, is talking about spiritual adultery. It is talking about God's people turning from Him. And when He says, I gave Israel their certificate of divorce, that's when you see Israel heading off and they're heading into Assyrian captivity. And when Judah is given, if you will, their certificate of divorce, they head into Babylonian captivity. Now, whether Gomer chose to worship idols or not, I don't know, it wouldn't surprise me. But I'm not there either. I do think that that was a problem for the people, but I don't think that that's the context in Hosea. So that leaves only one real big idea left, but the one big idea has two questions behind it. The fact of that is that this was a literal story. So within the literal story, the question that we have to ask, and it goes back to Hosea chapter 1, verse 2, by the way. When it goes back to Hosea chapter 1, verse 2, the question is that when Hosea married Gomer, was she already promiscuous and unfaithful when they got married, or did that happen after the marriage took place? That becomes significant. It is significant. By the way, I told you I had something to say about Leviticus 21. I need to say that now. That was a message that was directly to priests. But what was Hosea? A prophet. So there is some question of how much that particular command would impact Hosea. All right? So I want to really focus in on this idea that this was a real story that happened. So what about Gomer, though? When did this lifestyle of promiscuous activity, of adulterous behavior, when did that come about? Because I think that that's interesting. Now, I want each of you, if you will, because I think we've got a lot of different translations in the room. And so I'm interested in that. I'm going to read again. This is out of the NIV 11. Hosea chapter 1, verse 2. When the Lord began to speak through Hosea, the Lord said to him, Go, marry a promiscuous woman and have children with her, For like an adulterous wife, this land is guilty of unfaithfulness to the Lord. Does anyone's translation differ much from that? What are you reading out of, Judy? I can hold it up here if it helps. Okay. Okay, so go take yourself a wife of harlotry. Again, a wife of unfaithfulness. Okay. Okay. Anybody else? I don't like to sit here and stand on one translation that's this different, but I want to read this one to you. This is the NIRV. This is the New International Reader's Version, which just means that it's written on a more simple level, okay, than the regular NIV. And like I said, I think I've told you this. I study somewhere between 12 and 15 different translations of looking at this. And let me just read this, then we'll talk about this. The NIRV reads, "Go, get married to a woman who will commit adultery. Take as your own children who will be born as a result of her adultery. Marry her because the people of the land are guilty of the worst kind of adultery. They have not been faithful to me." One of the problems we run in good Bible study is that we want to make sure that our translations are translations and not interpretations. And so that makes it difficult. Now, and I know this one kind of stands out a little different, but here's why. Ultimately, this is about the covenant, right? When God went to the Israelites, when He went to Abraham in Genesis 12, or when He went to Moses in Exodus 3, but in particular, when He went to the Israelites in Exodus 19, because that is the point where this covenant begins, it gets 2 tablets, all right? So at that point, were the Israelites unfaithful to God at that point? No indication that they are. Now, we go through bumps in the road, right? We go in and out. But it was not one that necessarily started in unfaithfulness. It got to a point where it was unfaithful. But it went up and down. And so I think that's important for us to know. In all fairness, I don't have an answer for you. I do think that the story is a literal story. And I do think that Gomer cheated on her husband. And I think that the children that were born out of that were born out of that unfaithfulness. All right? So we do need to know that. I do think it was a literal marriage, and I do think that there was unfaithfulness involved in the marriage. I do, though, have this real big question, though, about whether it was unfaithful at the point of marriage. And I think that's still a real good question for us to take home. Now, having said that, here's the beautiful part of the story. Chapter 3, we're in Hosea chapter 3, verse 1. By the way, and I don't know that I've got this written down on the notes, if you look in Hosea chapter 2, verse 4, that's a pretty significant verse, by the way. I want to jot that down in your notes because it talks about that the children were born in disgrace. And I think that statement is very significant. All right? So we have an unfaithful wife. We have unfaithful children that are children of unfaithfulness that are born into disgrace. But look at Hosea chapter 3, verse 1. The Lord said to me, "Go, show your love to your wife again. Though she is loved by another man, is an adulteress. Love her as the Lord loves the Israelites, though they turn to other gods and sacred raisin cakes." Now, if we go through and finish reading that, we know that Hosea takes Gomer back. if my memory serves correctly, he bought her back. Why would he be able to do that? Because the person that she had left with was done with her. And now we start to see these spiritual overtones. Because at the time, have we not heard the phrase, as many of us have grown up, that sin has its season? And again, at this point, I can't help but start thinking about the prodigal son. Prodigal son being faithful to his father for a season, then he says, I'm done, give me my money, I'm out of here. And he goes off and he has his time. He is unfaithful to his father. He's unfaithful to his father until the point where sin season has run out. And then he's left what? He's left destitute. He has no money, he has no friends, he has nowhere to go. He is sitting in a pig slop pen, and all he can think about is the fact that his servants are eating better than he's eating right then. And so he turns around and he heads home. I look at this story in Hosea and I start seeing some of those overtones of Old Testament story and New Testament story, because both of these stories remind us that there is a God that loves us. There is a God that loves us in spite of our sin, in spite of the times that we are unfaithful to Him. And whether it's the story of Hosea or whether it's the story of the prodigal son, what happens? That story of the prodigal son could have just as well been named the story of the loving, faithful father. The patient, loving, faithful father. Because Hosea obeys the word of the Lord, and he brings this unfaithful wife and welcomes her back. And we look at that and we think, why in the world? Why would you do that? Because Hosea was interested in obeying the word of the Lord. Why would the father welcome the prodigal son back home? Because of his love for him. And so, friends, we constantly need to remember that we serve a God that even at the times when people run the farthest away, even at times we may have found ourselves the farthest away from God, that we serve a God that longs to welcome us back with open arms. Now, that's a message that needs to bring us joy. It's a message that needs to bring us comfort. And it's a message that we can take and share with the world around us. No person is ever so lost that they can't be saved by God. Amen. The only thing it requires, in Gomer's case, it was to accept the invitation to come back. In the prodigal son's case, it was the decision to turn around and to come back home. In the case of people today, it's the decision to turn from sin and turn to God. To believe of Jesus as Lord and Savior. To confess His good name, to turn from sin, and be baptized for the forgiveness of that sin. Because we can never get that far away that we can't turn and go back home. And so we remember that. That's a message that is important. It's important that we hear that. It's important that we share that. Because we live in a world that needs to hear it. We're going to sing this song. It's our closing song tonight. And if we can help you in any way, whether to become a Christian or to seek the prayers of our church family, we'd like to help you in any way. Let's stand and sing.